Having one affirming, trusted adult in the
Mm,
life of an LGBTQ youth reduces their suicide potential by 40%.
mm.
And that is just magic.
I'm Brian Henderson, Executive Director of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, or AWAB. Our mission is to create and support a community of churches, organizations, and individuals committed to the inclusion of LGBTQ plus persons in the full life and mission of the Baptist landscape. In this first season of the AWAB podcast, Voice of the Turtle, we're going to dig into the past while we face the present. The year 2026 brings some uncertainty for our LGBTQ plus siblings and allies, but we've been here before. Across 8 episodes, we're going to burrow our way through some of our history and talk to the people who made it and are still making it. In this episode, you'll hear from Reverend Dr. Cody Sanders, a longtime friend of AWAB. In 2022, Dr. Sanders was the inaugural lecturer for what has become AWAB's annual lecture program. With Dr. Sanders, we'll discuss how inclusion intersects with the church and the academy, and how, as LGBTQ plus folk and allies, we can navigate with some sense of balance and perspective this current season and time. Recently, I was reminded of a quote by scholar Cornel West. Never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. I've been thinking about this a lot, and having visited and spent time with folk from Minnesota, Colorado, and from Eastern Europe, where AWAB friends in the country of Georgia are experiencing significant oppression, and having connected too with so many people throughout our AWAB community facing the realities of the current administration in Washington, D.C., I am finding strength and energy in the courage displayed by people experiencing challenge and heartache. When people show up and stand up for what is right, it literally is like witnessing what love looks like in public. Someone said, sometimes there's more spirit in a pint than there is in a pew. Would you believe the story of AWAB, or the Welcoming and Affirming movement in Baptist life, traces its roots to a bar in Lincoln, Nebraska? This story, and many more, are told in AWAB's history written by Delane Tu, Finding a Home Among Baptists. You can order your own copy of this history at awab.org/book. That is awab.org/book. This book and its rich retelling of how many Baptists are welcoming and affirming provides the basis for this current Voice of the Turtle podcast series, digging into the past while facing the present. Again, you can order your copy of Finding a Home Among Baptists at awab.org/book. When I think of the long-standing work of the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, it is a story that has been rooted in congregational ministry, informed by pastors, scholars, and layfolk alike. Today, AWAB seeks to carefully balance what the church can teach the academy and how the academy can inform the church. There's perhaps no one better to offer insight into this dynamic than Dr. Cody Sanders. Cody is a queer Baptist minister originally from South Carolina who now lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, with his partner, also named Cody, and their dog, Susie. He serves as Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care Leadership at Luther Seminary, where he's also on the Working Preacher Leadership Team and co-hosts the Sermon Brainwave podcast. His most recent book is Spiritual Care First Aid, an all-hands approach for church and community, published by Fortress, 2025. And he has an updated edition of his book, A Brief Guide to Ministry with LGBTQIA Youth, coming out in March of this year from Westminster John Knox Press. Cody, thank you for taking time out of your, what I imagine is a very intense schedule. I want to begin by expressing how grateful I am for your pastoral presence as well as your scholarly contributions to church and society, and especially to our LGBTQ plus siblings and allies. Your voice echoes loudly and prophetically across Baptist and religious landscapes. Tell us how you first connected with AWAB and what roles have you had with the organization over the years?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm really appreciative for this conversation.
Mm,
I can't remember the exact year. It was when I was in seminary, and I went to the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship General Assembly in Washington, D.C.
mm,
This was probably around 2006, 7. I can't remember what year this was, but it was like first, I think the American Baptist churches had held their convention the week before, then the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, and then the AWAB meeting was right in between the two.
that's right. Yeah.
So I went to that meeting, and it was the first time I'd ever, actually, it was the first time I'd ever set foot in an explicitly queer Baptist space at all,
Mm,
and it was amazing.
mm.
I remember walking into the room of the sanctuary of the congregation. I think it was at Calvary Baptist is where that meeting was held, I believe.
I believe you're right. Yes.
Yeah, and I walked into the room and I saw all these people that I could identify as queer ministers. That was the first time I'd ever experienced that. It was,
Wow.
well, I remember one of the first people I saw down the long center aisle was Chris Copeland,
Oh, right.
and developed a friendship with him over time. That was a really liberating space. It was a time in my life when I was just beginning seminary, still very much kind of closeted about my own sexuality.
Mm,
A couple of years later, I would come out, I would find Oakhurst Baptist Church in Atlanta,
mm,
which has been a queer affirming church for a really long time. I would
yeah.
join the Alliance of Baptists, and so my queer Baptist world opened up a lot. But that first meeting was amazing. It was both really exciting and a little scary because it
Mm,
was the first time I could ever even imagine myself being in a place where I could be open about my own life and
mm,
sexuality in a sacred
right.
space. Then a few years later, I don't know exactly what year this was either, maybe 2009, 2010, I joined the board of AWAB and served on the board for several years. And that was a really fun time to be a part of, cultivating the life of this organization that had been full of people um, for decades that had been cultivating life in Baptist spaces that I could belong to and where I
Mm,
could serve. So it was a real privilege to serve AWAB in that capacity.
mm.
And then, other things here and there. Um, I think it was the inaugural lecture in
That's
the
right. Yeah,
lectureship series that AWAB does every year, a couple of years ago in Charlotte. And
that's right.
yeah, I love all my opportunities to serve AWAB.
Wow. When you were on the board then, who was the executive director? Was that Robin Lunds?
Yeah,
Here?
Robin Lund
Okay.
was the executive director at that point. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Good. I too remember. I remember that meeting in DC, and I was still very much closeted myself. I knew the meeting was happening. I didn't go to it, but I remember that the overlap with ABC and CBF that year. I do remember though my first AWAB service that I attended. It was when the biennial for American Baptist Churches USA was in Providence. And
Mm.
it was at First Baptist in America. And I went and I was there long enough into the service when I began to get worried and wondering, will someone see me here? And I
Mm.
quickly slipped out. So
Mm.
it took many more years yet before me for me to come out myself. So yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, as you are a part of this series with us in this Voice of the Turtle inaugural season, we're digging back into our past to discover how much more effectively and efficiently we can move through the present and into the future. So, digging a bit into your past, Cody, I recall one of your earlier publications, your book, Queer Lessons for Churches on the Straight and Narrow. Since this book was published, now nearly a decade and a half ago, what lessons would you say have stayed the same and which ones have changed?
Yeah, I think a little context for how that book emerged might be helpful
Sure.
too, because it connects to a lot of Baptist uh, people and places. I was invited to be one of the speakers at the CBF's Baptist Conference on Sexuality and Covenant back in I think it was 2012 when that was held at First Baptist Decatur. And I was having a really, really hard time figuring out how to address the question that they had asked me to talk about, which was, what are the boundaries of covenant? And it
Mm,
just felt so limiting to me to try to just get up there and give an apologetic for why queer people should be able to be in relationships. And I remember sitting in a coffee shop in Fort Worth, Texas, working on this lecture when it suddenly dawned on me that we are so limited by the questions we ask about queer and
Mm,
trans people.
sure.
And so I decided at that point just to ask a different question in my lecture. And the question I asked was, what do churches have to learn from queer people
Mm,
about relationships and covenant and intimacy and love and things like that? So that was the lecture I gave. And then several months later, I think I was at the CBF General Assembly and was walking around the display booths, and I came across the booth for Faith Lab, which was run by Jim Dant and David Cassidy. And Jim Dant was at the booth, and I was just looking around. I didn't even know what they did. And he said, I was at that Baptist conference on sexuality, and I was wondering if you ever thought about turning that lecture into a book. And I
oh.
said, no, I don't think I never thought about that. I don't know. And then I looked behind him and there were all these stacks of books. And I realized Faith Lab was a publishing operation. And I was like, but I could potentially think about that.
Yeah,
And so that
good.
one little question from Jim Dant is
Mm,
what led to that lecture becoming this book. And the whole book just asks basically what if we changed our questions
mm,
from ones of suspicious scrutiny about LGBTQ people and who can belong and who can be baptized and who can be ordained, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
mm,
And we instead asked questions of compassionate curiosity, where we were actually interested in learning from queer and trans people. How could churches grow from that orientation toward our lives? And so I don't know that the answers, because the book doesn't necessarily provide a lot of answers. It just talks about the kind of history of queer and trans people around what we've learned about love, what we've learned about community and forming community at the margins of oftentimes our families, our churches, our sociocultural, political sphere, what we've learned about things like forgiveness. I mean,
mm,
all those questions I think are still the pertinent questions we should be asking to help churches learn from the rich sources of wisdom of LGBTQ lives and experiences.
mhm,
What has changed since then is that, in 2012, when that lecture happened, in 2013, when the book came out, it was a time of pretty sustained progress
mhm.
toward LGBTQ inclusion, rights, visibility. We saw around that era the fall of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we saw just a couple years later the Supreme Court's decision on gay marriage. I mean, there were so many wins
Yeah,
for LGBTQ equality and justice when that book was coming out. And now, almost a decade and a half later, we see a reversal of that and
yeah,
the attack of LGBTQ lives and rights and visibility with Don't Say Gay bills and the attack on trans access to gender affirming healthcare and bathroom bills. I mean, all these sorts of things. Last year, there were over 600
right.
anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in legislatures across the country. 70 plus of those passed last year. We'll probably see about the same this year. So I think the context has changed significantly in 15 years.
Mhm,
And churches, I think, need to be asking those questions about LGBTQ community now because they need to be learning how LGBTQ people have organized and strategized and worked for justice in the midst of some pretty precarious and violent political circumstances, because that is where we are now more than we were in 2013.
mhm. Yeah, wow. Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's overwhelming at the same time, right? As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about our wins and losses from over the years. And when I like to tell some of our own AWAB story, when I like to tell some of our own queer stories, it's always helpful for me to remember all of the people who make those stories happen, right? And it's LGBTQ plus folk like ourselves, as well as our allies, and collectively together, we are doing what we do. And it's good to know that we're together, and yet it's a challenge always. We'll be right back with more of our conversation with Cody Sanders. AWAB proudly welcomes American Baptist Home Mission Society's as a sponsor of this inaugural season of Voice of the Turtle podcast. For nearly 200 years, ABHMS has promoted the Christian faith to impact lives positively. Inspired by the gospel that heals and transforms, ABHMS cultivates and empowers faith leaders across the U.S. and Puerto Rico. ABHMS partners with American Baptists and others to build networks, foster innovation in ministry, and deliver high-quality resources to educate and equip those who are passionate about healing and transforming the communities they serve. To learn more, visit the ABHMS website at abhms.org. Thank you, ABHMS, for your support. AWAB also proudly welcomes Knollwood Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, as a sponsor for this inaugural season. A generous grant from Knollwood's Missions Affiliations and Allocations Committee brings Voice of the Turtle to you today. Now, back to our conversation with Cody. Since Queer Lessons hit bookshelves, you've had several more books published. While not all of your books have centered around LGBTQ plus realities exclusively, a few have. So from your experience and research, and this might I think follow up pretty well with what we were just talking about. From your experience and research, what are three factors churches today ought to be considering or be mindful of when it comes to cultivating specifically spaces for LGBTQ plus our siblings as well as allies?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the books that I've written on these subjects are basically what I consider to be sort of toolboxes for churches to use in addressing this very question. Like, what are the simple, what's the information we need? What are the ways that we can get into the work and and advance this work of LGBTQ belonging and justice? I try to make them very accessible and practical, you know. So three things that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One comes from a statistic that I have recently, seen in the last year or so, and I just think is a magical statistic, which I normally wouldn't use that word for a statistic, but this one is magical. The Trevor Project, which is a
Mm,
LGBTQ youth suicide support network, have a lifeline, a text line, and lots of research, and they do these big studies of like 28,000 LGBTQ youth to look at mental health concerns and stuff like that. They found recently in one of those big studies that having one affirming, trusted adult in the
mm,
life of an LGBTQ youth reduces their suicide potential by 40%.
mm,
And that is just magic. The simple presence of a supportive, affirming adult has that much of a buffering effect on potential for suicide for queer youth. And I think churches should look at that and say,
mm,
okay, we need to be a place that foregrounds our LGBTQ inclusivity, justice, etc., in ways that people can see,
mm.
because it actually matters to people. It matters to their mental and spiritual and physical health to know, if one person can have that kind of effect on the life of someone, what is an entire church
Yeah,
and
yeah,
on a community? So to be visible, I think a lot of churches go through long processes of becoming affirming,
right.
and then they don't tell anybody about it.
Yeah,
And they don't put it out in ways that we can understand. Like I think terms like welcoming and affirming, or open and affirming, and more light, and reconciling in Christ, all of those are denominationally coded
right.
terms.
Yeah.
We need to say it in ways that people can see and take in. I think about a friend of mine who pastors a church in a rural area here in Minnesota, a small town out in the rural area, and they fly a pride flag and they're on their little church's lawn,
Mm,
and people comment about how much it means to them to see that pride flag. And they've had it stolen probably 3 or 4 times, and they just keep putting it up
right.
because it matters to people to see a church that is affirming of their lives in the midst of a social context in the US right now that is really intent on um, subjugating our narratives and the visibility of our lives, and attacking our livability of life. So that's the first lesson. Be visible in your support and celebration for the gift of LGBTQ people.
Right.
I think another lesson, And this is really a lesson, I think, for churches that have been affirming for a long time.
Mm,
What you did 5, 10, 20, 40 years ago. I pastored a congregational Cambridge Baptist church that
right.
became affirming in 1983,
Mm.
over 40 years ago, and has had two lesbian and two gay men as the pastors for most of the last 40 years,
Mm.
until I left there. But
I think someone who's gay followed you as an interim too, right?
Rick Mixon
Yeah, that's
followed as
right. Yeah,
interim. But
yeah.
yeah, this really long, rich history. But when I got there, I realized there was a lot of updating we needed to
Mm.
do to our knowledge about things like trans concerns.
Mm.
Because 40 years ago, they gave a lot of attention to education around LGBT concerns.
Right.
And I think any church that has gone through this process of education more than probably 3 years ago needs to do some updating right now about how to support trans people in your communities and just about education around gender identity, because
Mm.
oftentimes that gets left out. And we need things like Austin Harkey's book Transforming, or Justin Sabiatana's book Transgender Ministry Theology. There's another word in that subtitle. Those kinds of resources need to educate us about how we go further in our commitment to affirmation and justice for trans people. I think a third lesson,
Yeah.
this is a really broad one, I guess, is just maybe I guess I would call it a lesson in courage and
Mm.
risk.
Sure.
Because right now we are at a point where we can't just speak our affirmation for queer and trans people.
Yeah.
We have to enact it and embody it in ways that sustain people's lives.
Mm.
Another statistic from the Trevor Project was that after the 2024 election,
Mm.
the calls and texts they received to their suicide hotlines increased 700%
Yeah.
in the day after the election. So what's happening on the socio-political level impacts the mental health, the spiritual health, the physical well-being of people in our communities in ways that we don't often see, but it's really present in the lives of queer and trans people. And that statistic from Trevor, I think, is a good illustration about how even youth, who we might think aren't really paying that much attention to the socio-political level, they're getting it, they're seeing it, they know the impact it's going to have on their lives. So we need churches to step into more public, courageous spaces of risk taking in order to stand in solidarity with LGBTQIA people.
Mm.
And so that's a lesson I think that we have to continually learn, because what solidarity looks like in
Mhm.
practice changes from time to time, but it always comes with risk and it always necessitates courage. And I think we practice courage together.
Mhm.
We don't do that. We don't do it alone, but together we can really learn courage and how to put that into practice.
That's right. Wow. Yeah. Thanks, Cody. Yeah, there's a congregation not too long ago that reached out to AWAB, and they were courageous. They had in that your first lesson there of being visible. They had created around Pride. They had created a very visible picture on their chancel, and it included Pride colors as well as trans colors, right? And there was an individual in the congregation who took issue with it and was very upset and was concerned that this was going to make the congregation a target. To the congregation's credit and to the pastor's credit, they took time to talk about that and process it. One wanted to see it as a courageous moment, and as they processed it, they realized they heard voices that ordinarily don't get a chance to be heard. And so there were trans individuals who were participating in the life of the church who they were able to say, different from the individual who took issue with the display, they were able to say, actually, when we see what we are seeing on the chancel, we feel safe here. We don't feel like we're in danger. We feel like we belong. And again, to the credit of the church and the pastor and the congregation collectively, they heard each other. And so they allowed what one person wanted to be taken away right away, they allowed it to stay because they realized it was really helpful for them as a community. So yeah, wow. Well, Cody, thank you. These insights are really helpful. And especially given the realities that we're currently facing in our country and world. Christian nationalism, Trumpism, and so much seems to be threatening not just the state of democracy, but people. Human beings are being threatened and are being targeted. People of color, immigrants, and our LGBTQ plus siblings. Our trans siblings, as you were just highlighting, especially are facing life-threatening pieces of legislation that are downright awful and wrong. In this time of so much angst, fear, and anxiety, how do you keep from being completely demoralized? Do you have a word about hope that you can share?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about hope recently, and I'm working on some materials and a book related to the practice of hope. And I guess
Yeah.
that would be the thing that I would say first is I don't think of hope as a feeling
Mm,
or as a sort of internal disposition. I think of it as something that we practice together in community. And I think the most important thing that I can say about hope is that it doesn't stand in opposition to despair or hopelessness, but that hope actually starts
mm,
in our times of despair.
mm,
So if you're feeling despairing right now or demoralized, I mean, that's where hope begins.
mm,
If things are going well and you know things are going to work out, or you have a deep belief in progress or a deep commitment to optimism, those things aren't hope. I think
mm,
those are different things.
mm,
That's fine, but that's not the same thing. I think hope is tenacious and it takes a community of people to do things like looking realistically at the world as it is and understanding what you're facing together and to develop an anticipatory vision toward the future that suggests something to you about what could be happening instead of what is happening, and that you learn courage together and you practice care together for those who are at risk of falling through the cracks that are opened up by the violences of our society, and that you move together into this hopeful future, not knowing if things are going to work out.
mhm.
I mean, hope is not a guarantee in something.
Sure.
It's a vision for possibility and a sense of call into that future possibility. And I, again, think we do that in community, and that's what sustains me in the midst of this time. Jesus did not call solo disciples. He always called people into communities
Mm,
that followed in his way and that were animated by the Spirit. And that, I think, is the word that we need now,
mm.
that we need each other in order to practice hope together.
Wow. Yeah. This is going to sound it's going to sound crazy, Cody, but I was in the car wash earlier today and I was hoping that my car was going to get cleaned as I came out of the car wash because it was really bad. It's been really snowy where I live and the car had not been through the car wash for a while. While I was going through the car wash, I was on the phone with a friend. It's a true story. I was on the phone and my friend was asking me what I was going to do for the afternoon. I was telling them what I was going to do, and I knew that you and I were going to be having a conversation. I realized, oh, I've told this friend about Cody Sanders, and I said, I've told you about Cody. In fact, I've sent you some of his articles. Remember the one about hope, and hope is not a feeling, but it's if we want hope, we have to be the hope that we want to see come into reality. So, yeah, Cody, you give me hope in so many ways. So, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. It's been good to be with you for this episode of Voice of the Turtle. And you may know this, but the Voice of the Turtle was the name of an LGBTQ plus newsletter produced by Baptist in the late 70s and into the early 80s. It was the precursor to AWAB's current newsletter, The Welcoming Spirit. Voice of the Turtle's motto was, "Behold the turtle. It makes progress only when it sticks out its neck." How would you encourage folk today, and maybe even in this present time, to stick out their neck?
I think about this metaphor that I heard a while back that has always been really helpful to me in helping communities stick their neck out a little bit more.
Mm,
And it's this metaphor of wading and swimming and diving. And I
mm,
think those are helpful metaphors for how we think about risk and moving into places where we're sticking our neck out for justice and for the well-being of our neighbors. And so I think maybe just to think about where you are right now, like maybe you're taking some wading steps in your life, like you're
mm,
showing up at community meetings, you're showing up at Pride, you're going to a protest or two or something like that, but you feel like there's more. And more would be like starting to swim a bit. That's a little more risky. You're getting into deeper waters. But maybe you're joining a network of people who are taking collective action around some important matter of LGBTQ concern or immigration rights or whatever else. And then, you might be summoned into even deeper waters, into the diving,
Mm,
which I think is even more risky. And it may be things like, I think about about 100 of my clergy colleagues here in Minnesota who
mm,
were arrested at the airport a few weeks ago in their protest against the ICE occupation in our cities here. That's diving. They put their bodies on the line and were taken in, to jail by the police. Like so, it's a continuum, and we can't all dive all the time. But in our communities, I think there are people who are wading, people who are swimming, people who are diving, and people who are able to move back and forth through that continuum, depending on the circumstances of their life at the moment, the risk that is being presented. So, when you're trying to stick your neck out like the turtle, uh, look for that next
mm,
summons into deeper water and for the other people who are going to go into that water with you.
mm. Wow. Thank you, Cody. Look for that next summons. Thank you for sharing about yourself and from your wisdom and experience today. AWAB is grateful for you, and our world is better for the light that you share and for the ways you have and continue, Cody, to stick out your own neck for so many. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Please plan to join us for our next Voice of the Turtle episode when we visit with Reverend Dr. Cliff Matthews, Senior Pastor of the historic St. Luke Missionary Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. We'll learn more about St. Luke and we'll explore welcoming and affirming ministry in the Black church tradition. That's all the dirt for this episode of Digging into the Past while Facing the Present, Season 1 of the podcast from the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, AWAB. The podcast is produced by our friends at Good Faith Media. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org. Our music comes from Pond 5. This AWAB podcast is made possible by a generous grant from American Baptist Home Mission Societies and from Knollwood Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. You can learn more about us, AWAB, at awab.org. You can tap more of our free resources, including a list of fully welcoming and affirming Baptist-aligned churches in the United States and elsewhere. That's awab.org. Reach out. You can support us, and we can support you. Check out the show notes for more information. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast, give us a like and rating, and tell your friends about it. If you find yourself needing immediate support and someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call or text 988. I'm Brian Henderson. Stay encouraged. Remember, you are not alone.